Good morning. I'm Pamela, one of the clergy here at St. Clement's, and I'm happy to be sharing with you this morning. When grunge burst onto the scene in the early 90s, donning plaid shirts tied around the waist, ripped jeans, and an attitude to match, this perfectly proud Gen Xer was hooked. Pearl Jam, Nirvana, the Smashing Pumpkins, bands that played loud, sang loud, and did what they wanted instead of what was expected. It felt as if they were taking all the bottled up frustrations of the youth of my generation, shaking them up and letting them explode through their music. This was the music of my teenage years, and we ate it up. Much to our parents' dismay, my friends and I were taking scissors and sandpaper to our jeans to get the perfect worn look, complete with busted out knees, shopping at Goodwill instead of the Gap, and saving up for a pair of Doc Martens. Oh, and suddenly, everyone I knew was in a band. Only we were kids, and there was nowhere to perform. But we were resourceful. We traded high school dances for Battle of the Bands, and garages and basements became tiny concert venues. I don't know how, but somehow someone convinced one of the local churches to let us use their basement hall for a real concert. The night of the show, the church basement was packed with what seemed like every teenager in the city to listen to a lineup of 4 or 5 mediocre local bands covering all of our favorite songs. Now, anyone who knows anything about this whole grunge phenomenon likely knows what a mosh pit is. But for those who don't, let me explain. I suppose it's a form of aggressive dance, but it's more than that. During a concert near the front of the stage, the audience, huddled together, begins to move, to jump, to slam themselves into one another to the beat of the music, almost becoming a stomping entity of repressed emotion. And if you were lucky, someone would body surf the mosh pit. And you would raise your arms above your head and move the brave soul across the sea of people, hoping that you didn't sustain a boot to the head in the process. I know, it sounds rough, but in its chaos, it was cathartic. That night in the church basement, the mosh pit was as big as it could be. Unless you left the hall, there was really no way to avoid being swallowed by it. And I was right there in the center, all 120 pounds of me jumping up and down, slamming into everyone around me, having the time of my life. Well, I can't say for sure. My guess is that the church leaders who sanctioned the event were not expecting a capacity crowd and a mosh pit. It was an absolutely ridiculous scene, if ever there was one. Surprisingly, they let us stay. They handed out water, sat with kids who did get a boot to the head, and made sure we were safe. It felt like they were living out the Nirvana lyrics that we were screaming at the top of our lungs. Come as you are, as you were, as I want you to be. When I think of Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem, I always think back to that night. In part because I've always imagined this impromptu parade almost like a mosh pit. That is to say, absolutely chaotic. You've got crowds and crowds of people heading to Jerusalem for Passover. And among them is Jesus, making his way down the steep terrain from the Mount of Olives. And on the way, he sends his friends to get a donkey for him to ride. And when Jesus gets on the donkey to continue the downward path, the crowd is stirred up and a parade ensues. But this parade isn't orchestrated. It isn't like there's a parade convener who has dignitaries riding fancy floats lined up in an orderly fashion with ropes lining parade route to keep the people from getting too close. No, these are everyday folk who, when they see Jesus on the donkey, recognize him as the one they've been waiting for, the fulfillment of the prophets, the Messiah, the King. And they respond in an almost frenzied way with whatever's on hand, pulling palm branches off of the bushes and waving them in the air, taking off their coats and spreading them on the ground, pressing in on each other, trying to get close to Jesus and loudly shouting, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord." But this isn't the way kings usually enter their kingdoms, riding on a donkey with just anyone pressed in upon them. Two processions entered Jerusalem on a spring day in the year 30. Write biblical scholars Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan in their book, The Last Week. And they go on and they continue contrasting two processions, two parades. The one we've been talking about, Jesus on a donkey, surrounded by a large crowd of people, largely composed of peasants, moving along with its strange pageantry. And one from the opposite side of the city. The Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, entering the city on a war horse, at the head of a column of structured and orderly imperial cavalry and soldiers, as he comes to maintain law and order during the potentially tumultuous days to come. Now, Jesus' procession proclaimed the kingdom of God, note the authors, while Pilate's proclaimed the power of empire. And these two simultaneous parades end up embodying the central conflict of the week that led to Jesus' crucifixion. And while Borg and Crossan's Roman illustration is an imaginary historical reconstruction, it serves to punctuate the paradoxical nature of what's been unfolding in and through the life and ministry of Jesus, which is the invitation into a new way, following a king who does things differently, who rules not with an iron fist, but with acts of humility, acceptance, and love, into a way that brings God so close to us in Jesus that at times it seems too overwhelming to encounter. Still, Jesus comes so close, close enough for us to reach him, and keeps on inviting us to come as we are, meeting us in our everydayness and in our ridiculousness. Down a steep hill, riding on a donkey, as people wave tree branches or in a mosh pit in the basement of a church. My friends, there is no place that Jesus won't brave to be close to you. This week of weeks shows us that. This Holy Week where Jesus takes part in a chaotic parade, where he eats a final meal with his friends and cries in a garden as he prepares to face betrayal and judgment, where he dies on a cross next to a criminal who asks not to be forgotten, and where he overcomes death and shows us that he will never leave us. Will we welcome him in? Will we recognize him when he shows up in the places we don't expect him to be? Will we recognize him in the places we do expect him to be? I pray we do. And I pray that when we struggle to see Jesus in our midst, when we're too overwhelmed, preoccupied, or downright afraid, that we are surrounded by others who welcome him in on our behalf, who care for us, who embody Jesus' love for us. Like the ladies in the church basement who doled out endless glasses of water to a bunch of sweaty teenagers in 1992. Thanks be to God.